Previously in Hedge Knights, the pantry was expanded to fit all of the crops from the farm fields, which were much larger than the year previous. The Nutrifungus farm was expanded one last time to annex the area that was once dedicated for Hillroot. The trio trekked across the southern Ryza forest in search of the ruins. The Adlets back in the keep prepared to set up a much larger pasture for the bison, so they could freely roam. And the trio, having searched the mink bog, pieced together clues that the ruins must be nestled in the local wetlands. Episode 40, Gates of the Ruins. The trio rested more soundly, thinking they were on the right path towards the fabled ruins. Their clothing was protecting them from pollution fantastically, and they were in high spirits. With all of the work generated by harvesting the castle's many fields wrapping up, Judea and Tangier started to plan the new pasture and barn before Tangier neared her due date. 2 separate farms and pastures would be needed to keep Mojo and Lily apart. The Adlets simply couldn't handle any more bison calves. The barns themselves wouldn't be much larger than they were before, but the adjoining fields would let the bison roam, and with a little luck and some fertilizer, also graze upon wild grasses that started to sprout where the psychoid was once sown. They didn't yet know what would come of the current barns and fields, but perhaps they could be converted over as dedicated storage or maybe even a workshop. The air was getting colder, and there wasn't many farming tasks left to do, so Sappho and Lazarus planned to fell trees to replenish the dwindling lumber stockpile. While the twisted great pines yielded little wood, it had been a while since the last select cut, so there was plenty of trees around the castle grounds. After a brief survey of the proposed pasture, Judea noticed some of the soils were still polluted, and suggested everyone focus upon cleaning the pasture before taking on the rest of the pollution within the castle curtain walls. She wanted to surprise Mingahoof with a completed pasture upon his return, and prompted the others to help her surprise him. While traveling, Dave and Madsy had been foraging berries that occasionally grew by freshwater streams. Megahoof realized their provisions were running out, and suggested to the others that they start eating the berries before they'd spoil. Megahoof didn't want to resort to hunting the animals of the forest, but if they weren't careful about their supplies, that's what they'd have to do. Trekking through the dense and hilly forest was exhausting, especially in heavy protective clothing, so they found themselves eating more than usual. Lazarus was impressed with Klein's stockpile of blended fabric. He asked Klein if there was anything special he could tailor for him, and Klein's only request was for hoods for everyone, to help shield them from toxic breezes that frequented the glade. Lazarus promised to get right on it. The bellowing roars of giant bears were heard echoing off the cliffsides originating eastward. The Adlets had fought similar bears before. They had rampaged all the way into the keep when it was small and lacked perimeter walls. Unlike last time, the Adlets barely paid any attention. Wild animals, no matter how fierce, simply lacked any way to breach their boundary and castle walls. The adults told the boys to stay away from the outer walls, but apart from that, everyone else went about their usual business. Judea joked with Lazarus that if there was ever a time for visitors to raid, it would be now. She was morbidly curious whether the bears or the visitors would win in a fight. Lazarus said that bears would definitely win. All of the Adlets almost died when it was only 2 bears. But now over half a dozen stalked the castle grounds. There's simply no way visitors could repel such savage attacks. Judea nodded. Lazarus was probably right. Lazarus felt inspired to attempt to forge a blade that he could wield if a bear was ever to breach the walls like before. He took a break from tailoring protective hoods to heat up some steel ingots and forge himself a new falchion. He was hoping Megahoof would return with manuals about steelmaking. Steel would allow Lazarus to craft a great many weapons, armor, devices, and components that would significantly improve the lives of the Adlets. He took a gamble that Megahoof would be successful and treated himself to some of what little steel they managed to scavenge and salvage over the years. It wasn't doing any good just sitting in a barrel anyway, or at least that's how he justified it to himself for using the precious metal. While he was a fairly capable tailor and knew his way around the farm field, metalworking was his true calling. Besides 3 simple axe heads, he hadn't done any significant blacksmithing in quite a while. The Adlets simply didn't have much need for it. Occasionally he'd be asked to make some nails for doors or window frames, but Judea and Tangier were fairly careful to salvage the nails he had forged when renovations called for removing wooden edifices. Dave, Madzi, and Megahoof followed small brooks and streams towards the local wetlands in order to forage as many berries as they could. Megahoof asked the other 2 why wild creatures of the forest hadn't stripped the bushes clear of berries. He didn't understand how such delicious fruit was left untouched. Dave chimed in with a rather unexpected answer. The berries were poisonous to most of the creatures, causing Megahoof to spit up what he had in his mouth. Dave and Madzi laughed, maybe a little too loudly, and then Madzi said that the berries were totally safe, just not for the waste rats and toxalopes and other twisted creatures of the forest. Megahoof scratched his head. He thought it was pretty strange the pollution had twisted the creatures so much that some of their food staples were no longer safe to eat. He wondered if any such food was poisonous to visitors too, as so far, apart from the rather poor tactics and strategy, likely due to low intelligence, they hadn't shown any visible weaknesses. Back in the castle, Judea had just finished a well-crafted crib as a gift for Tangier. Klein had made some specially woven blankets to envelop the crib. Tangier was thankful for such a thoughtful gift and showed Lazarus the careful, intricate carpentry. While Lazarus answered his wife's beckonings, the 2 admired his freshly forged falchion, and Tangier asked him, "Is that really steel?" And he nodded affirmatively. Klein felt a little stir-crazy and needed to stretch his legs. He ran out to the outer boundary gate and closed it, and then told the others the boundary glade had been enclosed. While closing all the gates might invite visitor raids to breach their own way into the glade, the other Adlets agreed it would be nice to roam the hillsides, even if it was a little polluted. Sappho and Lazarus took advantage of the enclosed glade to fell trees to restock raw wood and timber, while the boys were just happy to have a play area to run around in and cloud watch. Megahoof, Dave, and Madzi settled into their bedrolls after a long day of travel. The forest was eerily quiet, unlike the bustling castle full of the grunts of bison, clanging of pots and pans, grinding of the quarns, or just the low chatter of the Adlets themselves. When trekking in the forest, with each footstep, twigs would snap and rocks would tumble, and in an almost empty forest, such noises were especially discernible. During the day when the trio traveled, they worked to minimize their noise so they could hear encroaching footsteps of lead-footed visitors before the visitors heard them in turn. But at night, when the Adlets were lying completely still, they could hear footsteps from almost as far as they could see. They slept in shifts, and while it was rather difficult to stay alert when the other 2 slept, the security that a near-perfect silence of the forest offered brought much comfort. The pastures were nearly ready, save for the small spit of land where the double strand had been planted. Sappho and Lazarus planned to harvest the double strand as late into the season as they could, gambling growth time against the encroaching winter frosts. They discussed sowing hay grass to replace the northeast double strand field as a way to further supplement the diets of ever-hungry bison. Nobody had a plan for the field, But since it was already purified and ready for sowing, they figured ample animal fodder would free up everyone from having to mill wheat by hand. Sapo felt especially nauseated when trying to cook as much of the soon spoiling pumpkin as he could. He leaned back and tried to assess his own condition with a clouded mind. He called for Judea and told her that he thought he had signs of plague, and that she should ask the others if they had symptoms, and if they did, put them on a strict schedule of bed rest. Tangier also looked ill, more than just typical third trimester illness, feverish and with chills instead. She ordered Tangier to rest completely and worried about the health of her baby. Judea was nervous as the only caretaker for the ill-stricken. She didn't have the experience managing outbreaks like Sapo did. She asked Sapo if he thought everyone should be isolated from him and Tangier, but Sapo said that everyone else was likely already exposed, except for the trio abroad, and that isolation wasn't likely to make much of a difference. Sapo told Judea to scour the Nutrifungus farm for any mushrooms that looked bluish. He told her the bluish ones offered some healing properties for plague, and that doctors in ancient times called it Ikiso. She conscripted Lazarus to help look, as he was much more familiar with what fungal caps normally looked like, and after a short search with handheld torches in the dimly lit room, he found a few caps that looked hopeful, and told Judea to bring them to Sapo to confirm. Sapo commended Judea on finding a queso so quickly, and told her to scrape half of it into 2 mugs of water so that he and Tangier could drink some now, and then to scrape the other half onto a designated patch of Nutrifungus, ideally capped adjacent to where she found it, so the queso could grow for future use. With Lazarus's help, Judea carefully tended to her newly given task and offered Tangier the mug of bluish cloudy water, but Tangier eyed the dirty-looking water skeptically. Judea reassured Tangier that it was medicine that Sapo had come up with, but that Sapo himself was sick, so she was the one administering it. She drank it with little complaint, and then pulled the sheets to bunch up around her. Judea went to fetch a fresh bolt of blended fabric, weighted and warm, to help Tangier with her chills. She offered a blended fabric blanket to Sapo as well, but Sapo said he was feeling hot and stifled, so she fetched a wet cloth and opened the shutters of his window to let in the cool autumn breeze. Sapo laid the wet cloth on his forehead, and then told Judea that he was trying to cook as much of the pumpkin as he could, but since he fell ill, she should designate a shelf in the pantry to store the meals, and anyone able to cook should use as much of the pumpkin as flour as they could, because what was stored inside was likely to spoil soon. Unfortunately, despite Judea's quick response, much of the pumpkin was already too far spoiled to be eaten or cooked with. She brought the pumpkin out to the bison. They were far less picky about rotting veggies than adults were. Lazarus knocked on Sapo's door and asked in a hushed voice if he had the energy to chat. Sapo waved him in. Lazarus lifted his visor and quietly but sternly asked Sapo to be honest. He needed to know what sort of outcome plague and pregnancy had. Sapo told him that if he and Judea had not found the blue Hikiso spores, likely both Tangier and their unborn would have died. Pregnancy is very hard on the body, and when paired with illness, it often makes a deadly combination. Since he and Judea had found Hikiso so quickly, and were already cultivating more, her outcome was much less grim than that. With proper rest, regular doses of Hikiso, and some herbal medicine, she truly ought to be just fine. The trio heard distant echoes of clashing iron, telltale signs of visitors. Unlike the usual routine of circumnavigating around the war party, the noise was likely the guards around the bastion, so the trio cautiously approached. Back in the castle, Tangier and Sapo were both showing signs of improvement. allowing Judea, Lazarus, and Shellbell to rest a little easier. While Lazarus wouldn't tell Shellbell the full truth about what sort of peril his mother was in, Shellbell could read the concern on his father's face, even through his armament. Even more of a telltale sign was that the other atlets were actively trying to distract and entertain him, something totally out of the ordinary. The fact that they wouldn't tell him the truth bothered him. He was nearly 10 years old. He was old enough to know what was going on, but as much as he tried to eavesdrop, he was only left to guess. He finally barged into his mom's room and bluntly asked if she was dying. She laughed hard enough to trigger a coughing fit, but then mustered an, "Of course not," answer. She told him she was just plain old sick, but because she was pregnant, it was a little more complicated than normal. Shellbell told his mom to promise that's all it was, and without hesitation, she responded, "Yes, I promise." Shellbell sauntered off, agitated that nobody was straightforward with him unless he raised a stink. From fatigue and late-stage pregnancy, Tangier slipped into an unwakeable sleep, and Judea rushed to rouse Sappho out of bed, despite him also being sick. Sappho checked on her vital signs and concluded that, much like himself, she too was recovering, but that she'd been so sapped of energy, she needed to recuperate beyond just simple sleep. Sappho told Judea not to administer any food or water, as it was no longer safe and she could choke, and to just watch for any worsening of her condition, and to fetch him if she was concerned. Just as soon as Sappho finished speaking, Tangier opened her eyes and said, "I can hear you both, you know." Sappho nodded, smiled, and returned to his quarters. The trio arrived at the foot of a small rocky outcropping that had clearly been quarried and built up upon into a defensive spire. To the east, they saw a hive of death-stinger hornets and heard the faint buzzing of wings, and also the clattering of metal armor. Dave signaled to the others to quietly move opposite the commotion and to dip out of view behind the stone enceinte of the bastion. As they rounded the bastion, they could hear the sounds of battle between some of the armored visitors and the death-stinger hornets, likely the same noise they heard from a distance when they made their approach. Dave whispered to the others to watch their footing and to make as little noise as possible, and waved them to follow. The sounds of combat abated, followed by the clinking of armored footsteps. It was clear which of the two groups remained as victor. As they rounded a jagged rock face, the trio spotted a tiny section of marsh, untouched by the pollution, covered by a thick, lush grass, and silently made their approach. Dave was the first to delicately retrieve his bow from his torso, and readied an arrow on his bowstring. The others followed suit. Dave carefully placed his pack on the ground so as to not be encumbered if they had to flee. Megahoof and Madzi did the same. Just as soon as they placed their bags on the ground, a visitor rounded the corner, and the trio let loose a volley of silent arrows, skewering the leather-bound visitor. Just as soon as the fatal blow was landed, another halberd-wielding, leather-bound visitor ventured towards the Adlets. Dave was concerned he was attempting to rally others and signaled to pursue and prevent him from alerting other defenders. The second visitor was quickly felled by arrow fire, and Dave motioned for them to fall back into the tall grass. He whispered that visitors had much better night vision than Adlets did, and that they were quite lucky to catch two by surprise. He told Megahoof and Madzi to unroll their beds on whatever dry ground they could find, and that he'd be taking first watch. He wanted to listen for signs of other visitors inside the bastion, and to see if any checked up on the 2 guards of the gate. They needed more information before proceeding inside, and the best way to gain such information was to be patient and observe. Megahoof and Madzi found it nerve-wracking to sleep so close to a bastion potentially full of visitors, but they knew that they needed their strength to face what tomorrow was certain to bring. Sapo had already made a full recovery and assumed the role of primary caregiver, relieving Judea and allowing her to rest and recover herself. Despite tending 2 very sick patients, she had managed to complete the barns and pasture fencing. Building offered her a way to clear her head as she worried for both Tangier and Sapo, and also that of her husband, Dave and Madzi, who were bushwhacking around the wild world searching for fragments of a long-dead kingdom. Tangier was well on her way to making a full recovery. While Lazarus was checking up on her in her room, Sapo entered and gently shut the door behind him. He mentioned to the couple that there was a possibility that their unborn child may have been affected by the illness, and that Tangier should be especially attuned to how frequently she felt kicks and movement, as they were the best signs of health that Sapo could measure non-invasively. This wasn't easy news to break, but he felt they both should know. At the base of the fabled ruin, the trio rested, building up strength for what was soon to come. Thank you for tuning in to Hedge Knights, episode 40. If you would like to support me as a content creator, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this content with your friends. If you would like to support me more directly, a link to Patreon can be found in the description of this video. If you would like to catch a live stream of mine, Rhadamant.com has my stream schedule, countdown timers to upcoming streams, and a link to Twitch. Thank you so very much for watching, and a special thank you to my Patreon patrons, Twitch subscribers, and viewers like you that support the channel and made it all the way to the credits. Thank you so very much. Farewell, my fellow adlets.